Good morning. We'll be starting up here in a minute or so. Um, but welcome. You might want to go ahead and open up your chat pod and open up your Q&A and get ready to have hopefully a little bit of learning and a little bit of fun. We'll give folks about 30 seconds to log in, and then we'll get started. Okay, good morning and welcome. And hope everybody is having yourself a good day. It's a little gray here, but maybe we'll get some rain out of it, but the forecast doesn't say so. We could use some rain. The water's definitely low, but that's also means it's going to make it harder for me to rake leaves this Saturday. So we'll have to play that by ear. So good morning and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about local roads and street plans. A couple of, you know, logistic things before we get started. Open up your chat pod. That'll be at the bottom. That's how we're going to send you links to the handout and to the poll, so you don't have to type everything in, though you can type it in or download the app as it says on screen. Open up your Q&A, because that is how you're going to be able to put in your questions, and we'll answer those questions as we go through the course of our hour together. And then be ready to raise your hand. So I'm going to ask you to raise your hands a couple of times during our hour together. So that should be the preliminaries. My name is David Orr. I'm the director here with the Corner Local Roads program. We're your New York State LTAP Center, and we're in the middle of a series of webinars that we're doing on roadway safety specifically. There's a handout that, again, is linked in the chat pod. And the materials come from many sources. There's a whole bunch of links there, but the three primary sources are proven safety countermeasures from the Federal Highway Administration. I'm showing a graphic from their rural communities one, but there's actually a lot more than just rural. There's urban ones as well. We'll be talking about those next week. Our workshop on solutions for safer roads and streets, which actually pulled a lot from some of the materials that we're talking about today and from the Federal Highway Administration, and the New York State's Roadway Departure Safety Action Plan. And we'll be talking a little bit more about that, though we talked more about that last week and why it was put in place. Now, a bit of a welcome and to say hello, and we'll, of course, do a poll to get started. Helps me see who's on the session today. And let's start with who you work for. Do you work for a town, a county, a city, or village? Are you with the state or the feds? Are you tribal? You're a consultant? You're a contractor? Or you, everybody's working for the weekend. So we'll see. We'll see what we have here today. Okay, so nice variety. I like it. Okay. So a lot of consultants and folks who work with counties. And then we have a blend of other municipal types. And 4% of you are working for the weekend. Okay. What's your job? Are you an administrator, highway superintendent, engineer, field crew, supervisor, board member, none of the above? Um, if you're with an MPO, you're probably going to put in none of the above, but just top that into the Q&A so we know for sure that that's your primary role. Um, maybe next week I'll add MPO in there as a planner as a job title. But a lot of you are engineers, probably because you are going to be able to get one professional development hour out of this, but hopefully because you want to learn about local road safety plans and how to implement them. That would be my primary reason. Again, if you can't access the poll, you can put it in the poll in the Q&A. I can use that and just sort of mentally add that in my head. Okay, cool. And let's see, we get the same map of where you're from as we got last time. Where are you from around New York State? You can click on the map, get a good variety. That looks about like we did last week. Oh, we got two people in their boat today. Oh, three people in their boat. Out and about in the boat. I didn't know you got Wi-Fi in the middle of the lake, but okay. Well, Wi-Fi is everywhere with these little satellite links. So, okay. So we get a variety of folks from all over the place. That's good to know. Okay. And ooh, we have somebody who's actually from Vermont, or their Wi-Fi, they're actually in their boat on the lake, and the Wi-Fi doesn't click right. I don't know. Okay, cool. That helps me. That means we've got a mixture of rural and urban. It means we've got a mixture of folks who have different job titles, but a lot of you engineers are consultants, and that's fine. Last week during this series of webinars, we talked about the reason why the state put together the Roadway Departure Safety Action Plan. And a lot of that comes back to we want people to get home safe every single day. And when you look at the fatalities across the United States and across New York, they're up since pre-COVID. We were getting close to 30,000 people annually a year. Now we're over 40,000. We need to get back down to 30. In fact, our goal really should be zero. And we should also be focused on the more severe crashes as well, because those are life-changing. Now, as part of this, the Federal Highway Administration has crash focus areas that we talked about. There's roadway departures, there's intersections, bicyclists, and pedestrians. There are other kinds of focus areas for crashes, but those are the three big ones because they're the majority of the fatalities and serious crashes. Roadway departures, in fact, make up almost half of all fatalities, which is why New York State Department of Transportation put together their Roadway Departure Safety Action Plan. And it is linked in the handout. And again, if you open up your chat pod, in about 10 seconds, magically, it's going to reappear the link. So if you haven't opened it up yet, you get a chance here quick to do that. And you'll be able to download the information from the Roadway Safety Action Plan. And when you do that, make sure you also download the appendices because they're going to be valuable as well. They've got a lot of really good information. I'll even mention them a couple of times today and over the next couple of weeks. Now, the concept for the roadway departure is simple. We start by keeping vehicles on the road with good countermeasures such as traffic lines and delineation and things like that. We reduce the potential for a crash by making sure that if someone does go off, they can safely get back on the road and don't hit an object, so we have good clear zones and maybe a safety edge. And then finally, if they have a crash, we're trying to minimize the severity of that crash by having breakaway hardware and having things that are not going to be a deadly fixed object or protecting it with rail if need be. And of course, once we've done this, we have to revisit and figure out, okay, are there other places we need to look at? So it's a cycle. It's not really ever a stop. We just keep looking to try to make sure people get home safely every single day. This is also part of the concept of the safe systems where we, rather than looking at individual things, we combine everything together. So we have to have safe road users, which means we have to have some education, not just of the folks who are doing the work on the highways, but the public themselves, the boards, elected officials, all kinds of different folks. And that actually is part of a good roadway, local road safety plan. We want safe roads, and that means we want to make sure we don't put things that are going to cause problems, but we also need to look at the design and how humans drive it because humans are part of the equation. We're going to have some enforcement, but we also want to think about designing roads that have people drive at a reasonable speed. I'm a big fan of traffic calming, but I'm also a big fan of having an overall review when you do traffic calming. Spot improvements just move the problems around. You want to, of course, have good post-crash care. We've talked about that before. We'll talk about it again. That golden hour does make a difference. And of course, the vehicles. Now, hopefully we don't have Corvairs and vehicles like Pintos anymore, but there are still sometimes issues. But more importantly, people don't always do the maintenance. So we have to make sure people understand the value of good tires and keeping their brakes working. And that's why we're adding some of the safety features to help work with everything else so that, again, one mistake doesn't lead to a fatality and everybody gets home every single day. So let's develop a local road safety plan. Let's go through the process. This is a graphic that was put out by the Federal Highway Administration. Again, it's linked in your handout. You're more than welcome to download it as a reminder of the steps that we're going to go through. And I actually find it interesting that right before we get to implementation, they put in a roundabout. And because implementation is one of the places where we tend to get close and then we don't actually implement. And we divert. Oh, well, we got a nice plan, but we don't actually implement it. And it doesn't matter how good your plan is. If you don't actually implement the solutions, it's just a plan that sits on a shelf along with the elf. Okay? So let's go through the steps. We're going to talk about identifying stakeholders. That's really critical. Okay? If we had more than an hour together, we could probably brainstorm and do a lot more, but we'll do a little bit on that. Because the next step is then we're going to take data and the input we get from the stakeholders, and we're going to develop risk factors. We're going to develop concentrations on where we want to spend our money. We're going to choose proven solutions. We'll talk a little bit about why today, and then next week we'll talk about the solutions themselves. And then we're going to have to implement those solutions. We're going to have a plan, and we'll talk a little bit about that process. Okay? So let's go through these 4 steps and just remind ourselves of what's critical and what's not critical. Now, identifying the stakeholders. Um, I told you I was going to ask you to raise your hand. Raise your hand if you've ever been part of a road safety audit or road safety assessment. Raise your hand. Let's see how many of you raise your hand. And that's at the road safety audit level, that's actually a formal designation that the feds put together to look at road safety problems. And the concept behind it is actually a pretty cool one. So about 10 of you or so. You don't just have the highway department look at safety. You don't just have the engineer. You don't just have the public safety folks. You have a whole group of different people. This is one we did out with the town of Clarence, where you can see the highway superintendent is there in his bright yellow vest. You've got folks from the sheriff's office, the troopers, the business community, elected leaders, people who live in the neighborhood, schools. You get a variety of different people who then provide a different set of viewpoints. Okay? Now, let's see what you come up with. Who would you want to have as stakeholders for an overall local road safety plan? And I'll go ahead and put the responses up here. We'll just build ourselves a little Wordle. Let's see who you think should be stakeholders on a local road safety plan. Commuters, yep. Residents, police, public officials, yep. Engineers, people from the highway and the DPW, very good. The school buses especially need to be involved, the people who are moving things around. Okay, yeah, emergency management. Yeah, if you're going to have a safe systems approach, you need to include folks who are providing emergency management. That might change your choices. Okay, I see everyone, and everyone is nice, but remember, you want a group that is manageable to some extent, but you do want to provide input points. So even as you're putting together a team that's going to help build your local road safety plan, you do want to have a place for the public to provide input, maybe a public online forum where they can put in comments and ideas and somebody who can go through that. So yeah, you could build this. And again, one of the first steps is take yourself a small group and start building a list of who you want to have in your larger group. But how big that group is something you have to decide how big you want to manage it. I've been part of several different local road safety action plans. I've seen groups as small as like a road safety audit down to 10 or so. I've also seen one that was over 40 different people involved. Both can work, but you need to manage expectations and you need to have good ways to get input. So that's a really important step. And there's 3 reasons that you want to have a good list of stakeholders. One, obviously, is you get ideas. People have different viewpoints. You can get those ideas and blend them into your process. Number 2, when you're done at the end of this process, to implement it, you got to have money. You've got to be able to spend money. And a lot of that may be local dollars. You've got to have the buy-in from the residents, the taxpayers, and the elected officials, and you want to get them as part of the process. You're not going to be able to implement as much without everybody on board. And then finally, you may find answers you didn't expect. That's pretty cool. And just so you know, best way to enter of all of these polls is to go online to pollev.com/DavidOrP as it's listed at the top up there. If you can't access these polls, just put it in the Q&A and I'll mentally add that into my comments and thoughts. And again, we could spend a lot of time talking about stakeholders, and we'll mention them again. They're really an important process to get ideas to implement good solutions. Okay? Now what I want to do now is I want to take and figure out how to use safety data, and what we're going to focus on are risk factors. What we're looking for are either crashes that are really common, the most common crash types, and spend our money focusing on those, or those that are overrepresented. Now, there is a third possibility. You might have some hot spots as you do your analysis. You might find spots where there's a hot spot. We'll talk about that in a minute. But really what we're going to focus on is the most common type of crashes and pick good countermeasures are those that are overrepresented. So let's talk about those, and we're going to apply systemic countermeasures. So in terms of fatal crash types, as an example, if we just take all the fatal crash types, about 11% are due to people who overturn, that go off the road, roadway departure, and they turn over. Now, I hate to say a pretty high percentage of the people who are fatally killed in that case weren't wearing their seatbelt. The single most valuable thing people can do is put their seatbelt on for an overturn. A lot of people don't do that. That's part of our education part and component. We need to get people to do that and understand that. Head-ons is an issue. That number has actually come down. Head-ons used to be much more serious, but they're still an issue, still a pretty high percentage. And finally, hitting a fixed object. So if you just add those up right there, you're talking about 50% of the fatals are due to just these few things. So we may want to focus on that, work on ways to help people not overturn, figure out ways to not have them hit each other, such as with a rumble strip, or removing objects that if they hit them lead to a fatality. So that would be your most common crash types. Okay? And as we talked last week, trees, by the way, are the single most common hit object. Okay? And then we're going to focus not on where the crashes have occurred, but we're going to focus on places that have higher risk before the crash occurs. We call this systemic safety. Okay? So we take and we look at all the crashes and we figure out where the risk factors are. So this is something we showed last week. Well, you'll probably see it again because it's that critical. And that is, think about if you take all the crashes and you plot them, where should you be putting your money? Your brain says, well, hey, there's a couple of dots that are close to each other, and there's a couple of spots that maybe there's a hot spot, and there might be. But make sure you look carefully at it and realize, well, they're actually a half a mile apart, or they're on two different curves, or the intersections are a little bit further apart than we think. And a lot of times the crashes are just random events. And what we really want to do is focus on the places that have higher levels of risk, more possible risk factors. Okay? Now, before we get into that a little bit, I do just want to remind you we're using the term crash, not the term accident. That's the old term. In fact, the old repository for crash information was called ALICE, accident location. And now it's clear, crash location. Okay? Why? Well, we're focused with crashes on the events. We're not going to assign blame. We'll worry about that. We want to get people safe. We want to get them taken care of. And then we'll worry about issues to solve the problem. So we're using the term crash, but I will sometimes still say accident. But really, we should be consistent. Now, in terms of crashes, we do want to worry about the probability a crash occurs. We want to focus on the high severity crashes. And like it or not, we're comparing everything being equal. A place that has more exposure, i.e. traffic, is probably a place we're going to want to spend our money. Get the most bang for the buck. Okay? Now, in terms of risk factors, here's a study that was done by New York State DOT. We mentioned it last week, and it's a really useful reminder of how this works. You go through and you make a list of all the crashes that have occurred, and you compare that with what you think are the risk factors. In this case, they looked at the curve radius. So they plotted the number of curves, so the number of segments, and did a percentage of the entire system. And we're looking at the sharper curves, so it's not 100%, of course. And if you look at the percentage of curves, you should have a match to the percentage of crashes if there is no additional risk. But as you can guess, when they started plotting the number of serious crashes compared to the radius, there are a lot more crashes occurring percentage-wise on the sharp curves, the 100 to 300 foot ones, the 300 to 500 foot ones, even a little bit more in the 500 to 700 foot range. Only when you get up to the pretty flat curves does that number fall in line or even drop below the number of curves themselves. So in terms of spending money, really probably want to spend or look at issues on the sharper curves because we'll get more bang for our buck. That's where the problems are occurring. So keep that in mind. When the state put together the Roadway Departure Safety Action Plan, they did an analysis on the state system for different types of roads, arterials, collectors, rural, urban, interstate, non-interstate, things like that. Those are in the appendices. That's why I'm telling you download the appendices. Here are some risk factors for rural collectors that you can use already. You don't even have to go out and analyze them, though I would advise you to do so, as we'll talk about how to do that here in a little bit. In this case, for traffic volumes, they found that middle-level traffic volumes tended to have higher crash rates than anticipated. Probably just enough traffic to make it busy, not enough to, a little bit more chance of head-ons or conflicts. Curve radius that were sharp, the sharp ones, really, it's really under 300 feet because don't have any that are under 100. And then shoulder width, 1 to 3 feet, i.e. narrow or no shoulders. And depending on the type of road, it will be different. If you don't have shoulders at all, you may have to do a different analysis, but this is something to think about. So one way to get started is make a list of what you think might be common risk factors, and then go get the data and confirm whether those truly are risk factors in your area. So let's make a list of the common risk factors on your roads and your streets that you think might be something you need to investigate. So let's see what you come up with. The geometry of the roadway, the shoulders, how wide they are there fixed objects? Yep. Are there drop-offs on the edge? Yep. Trees near the roadway? Wildlife? Okay. Wildlife's a tough one, but it does tend to be seasonal, but it is something to think about. Curves, traffic volume, yeah. Volume is a pretty, speed is an issue that we know about, yeah. Okay. So you can do all kinds of things. And again, if you can't access the poll, type it into the Q&A and I'll just, again, add it to the list of possibilities. Sight distance. Are there pedestrians or bicyclists, those vulnerable road users, which is, they call it in pedestrians and bicyclists as a focus area, but really they're talking about vulnerable road users. Okay. So again, what you're going to do is you're going to make a list. That list will probably maintain as many as 20 or 30 items. You're not going to want to try to do an analysis on all of those, and you may find some of them aren't as critical as you might think, and we'll come back to that. And a couple more people have thrown in is some road crowns and edges. We see speed again. Again, all risk factors that you can think about. So let's just take an example site, and we're going to make a very small little network here, only because we're doing a 1-hour webinar and we can only do so much. But let's imagine that when we did our analysis, we found out that sharp curves, high speed, downhill, higher volume were risk factors. We looked at all the crashes that occurred in our community and maybe even nearby communities, and we found that those were the critical things that were overrepresented or most common. That most crashes occurred on sharp corners, or they occurred a lot when there was higher speed, or they occurred on a downhill grade, and maybe the higher traffic volumes. Okay? Now we take that information from the entire network and we apply it to a specific part of our community or a specific subset. Okay? And we apply to every single segment because obviously the crashes didn't occur everywhere. So we're going to have segments of roads or intersections, we'll talk about segmentation here in a little bit, that don't have crashes. Now you'll notice I have crashes listed as a risk factor. So again, I'm going to lower everybody's hands. I want you to tell me, do you think crashes are a risk factor by themselves? Raise your hand if you think they are. Raise your hand if you think crashes by themselves are a risk factor. Okay. So let's see how many people raise their hands. About a third of you raise your hands. If we really believe that the events are random, then crashes are not really a risk factor. They just happen to occur in one place versus somewhere else. However, a series of crashes at a spot might be telling us something, and we just don't know what the risk factor is. We might have missed it in our analysis. It might turn out maybe we should have actually had a risk factor for a narrow clear zone and we missed it. And we had a lot more crashes that were occurring on certain types of roadways. So, in of themselves, crashes technically probably aren't a risk factor, but it can be a surrogate for one. And this is maybe even more important. Remember, first thing we did, we got those stakeholders. Can you imagine going to a meeting and saying, we don't care if there was crashes here, we're not going to worry about it? Not going to be the best communication tool. There really is a need to discuss with folks and mention, hey, look, if there was a crash, we at least want to examine that. Okay? So I would include crashes in your list for lots of reasons. But just realize that technically, some people can argue legitimately that crashes in of themselves are not a risk factor. But as somebody put into the Q and A, there's probably a pattern involved there. There may be something. So again, it may be something we miss when we do our risk analysis. So I would always include them for a variety of reasons. So then what you do is, if you create this list of risk factors, and how many? With Washington State, they had every single county in the state. The number of risk factors they used ranged from 6 to I think a dozen, if I remember correctly. You don't want so many that it gets hard to understand, but you definitely want to have a range of them that are valuable for the communities that are involved. So here we only have 5 because we can keep it simple. But again, 10 or so is probably an upper limit for most agencies. But think about that. What can you understand? What can you explain to people? Okay. Now, you could put weighting factors on here. Some of the road safety plans, people will do that. They'll put a rating factor. So maybe a crash gets a higher weighting factor than downhill, or maybe high speed gets a higher weighting factor than sharp corners, or vice versa. But as a starting point, I actually recommend stay with just simple add them up. Start looking at it and realize, is it worth the having to explain it to everybody, the weighting factors, and then the debate about what should the weighting factors be, versus, hey, these are risk factors. We're going to focus where we have more risk. So in this case, you just would add them up, okay? Just add up the numbers. And in this case, we've got the number of factors, 1 for Jones Road 1, 3 for Jones Road 2, and so on. And the priority then is just the highest number of risk factors. So if I was doing this particular network, my priority roads would be Jones 2, Smith Street 1, and Smith Street 2. What's interesting about this, when you do these analyses, you may actually find locations where there's no risk factors and yet there was a crash. So what you're going to want to do in all of these cases is you're going to do a project level actual and final design. But you also might want to look at, why did that crash occur? If you find some risk factor you missed, you could add it back into the system. Or you may find maybe it was a deer crossing. Somebody hit a deer. That can be really hard to figure out and really hard to do much about it. So maybe you have to realize that, that one-off crash is something that isn't as high a priority because it's something that is a one-off. It isn't really based on risk factor or approach. Okay? Again, I'm not saying that we're not going to get to it, but just prioritization. We're looking where there's more common risk. And what's great about this is you can actually tell the public, we're going to focus on solving the problems before the crashes occur. We don't have to wait until a crash occurs to fix an issue if it's got a lot of factors involved. Okay? Now, of course, to do this, we got to do a lot of data collection. We've got to get information that we can then turn around, analyze our crashes, compare that to the measured and other collected data, and determine our risk factors. Now, in terms of measured data, that's best. Lane width. Hey, you got a CHIPS report. You got measured data for that, for lane width. Things that you can measure absolutely are your best bets in a lot of ways. Okay? Speeds, traffic volumes, things like that. Okay? Have a great question in the Q&A. I'm going to leave it up because I'll come back to that one in a little bit because it actually shows up in an actual road safety plan that was put together when we talk about them. So leave that question up, Amanda and Jody. Qualitative data. Qualitative data is data that you don't measure it, but you can get a quick sort of good, bad, or ugly kind of thing. like shoulders. Maybe you don't have time to measure them on a first cut, but you could say no shoulder, narrow shoulder, wide shoulder kind of thing. Uh, those are okay. Qualitative things can be good, but even traffic volumes could be done that way. We do that for our asset management program with the students in the summer. We just range the traffic level. You could do that in a pinch too. And then there's surrogate data. I actually like surrogate data, and you have more of it than you think. Okay, so as an example, surrogate data here, you have your curve sign. And if the curve signs have been placed using a ball bank or Riker or some other technique, then it tells you something about the sharpness of that corner. And if you compare that to the speed limit, you get a differential. That probably is a pretty good thing to check, as it might be a risk factor. If that's a 55-mile-an-hour road, 30-mile-an-hour curves, is that a risk factor? Okay, those are surrogate data. There's lots of other data, crash reports, things like that. The current repository system that's available here in New York State is Clear, and we'll talk a little bit more about Clear in just a minute. Okay, Clear is something that you can use, but you're probably going to need to go beyond it in many cases. But it's a pretty cool tool to start with. So what measured data do you have? Okay, and I'll just go ahead and pop this into reports mode. What measured data do you have? You have traffic volumes. Traffic volumes are actually pretty easy to get. I can get them in 15 minutes. Maybe you've got turning counts and lane widths and speed. Okay? You can actually use the crashes / accidents that are available. Okay? Turning radius. Okay? And again, if you don't have it, you can do a surrogate using your curve signs. So think about the data you've already got. Make yourself a list and figure out, oh boy, I'm actually missing something. There's pretty good evidence we know that long downhill grades lead to problems, but do we have that measured? Do we know where those points are? So again, you might want to start making a list of your possible risk factors and then what data would help you find those risk factors. Okay? So the one that came up that's in the Q&A, somebody says, how do you address impaired drivers with risk? Well, as an aggregate, as a whole, it's really hard to do because that's part of this random one-off situation. You know, the one drunk driver who has a blood alcohol level of 0.25, who is going 115 miles an hour in a 30-mile-an-hour zone, that's going to be really hard to do much. Though if we've got good emergency management, we might actually be able to at least keep them out of long-term serious accident, crash, get my word right. But in the local road safety plan, one of them that I've looked at, they actually looked at the fact that there was a concentration of crashes near local bars and restaurants. And so they put the distance from the bar and the restaurant. They had a part of their community that they highlighted as a higher risk zone because of that. And by the way, certain times of day were worse than others as well. So they needed to do targeted enforcement, and they needed to look at some of the sight distances and distractions as they were developing their action plan, their proven countermeasures. So yeah, there are things you might need to think about. That's why getting started with what you have is so critical. Okay? So in terms of what measured data you have, you probably have more than you think. You have traffic counts. If you don't have traffic counts, there's some good, quick ways to get that. And by the way, New York State has a data traffic viewer. You can go online, and it's got a bridge in your community. It'll have a count. You can do a 15-minute count if you don't have a full count. There's lots of ways to get counts. Same with speed. There's some quick ways to get speed, and you probably have more of that than you think. And again, that would be one you could do with counters if you can, could borrow some counters. The advisory speed on the curves could be useful for something. Your lane widths, again, you're supposed to have that for your CHIPS report. Your shoulder widths and types, so you have curbs and gutters and things like that. Is it rural versus urban? That can make a difference because of typical speeds that people drive and the land use around it. Who's the owner of the road? Most of the time when we do local road safety plans, we can't just do a single owner. We have to do a larger focus. We'll talk about why in just a minute. But later on, you might be developing a plan for a specific owner. When you're doing that, knowing who the owner is will be useful later on when you start looking at developing an implementation plan. Okay? And it could theoretically be something you need to incorporate in your statistics. So again, we could make a long laundry list, but at the same time, think about those risk factors we did earlier. What are some options if you don't have the data? Okay? So if you don't have the data, you could do some qualitative or surrogate data. Okay? So as an example, for curve radius, that's related to the advisory speed for the sharpness of the corner. So you could take your advisory panel, compare that to the speed limit, and the differential is actually a pretty good surrogate for curve radius. It also incorporates inside of it the super elevation of the road. Are there sight distance issues? Is it smooth? Those all show up to some extent. So you might use that. For clear zones, maybe you don't want to go out and measure them, but you could drive down and qualitatively go, well, it's a narrow clear zone, it's a wide clear zone, there's a lot of trees in the bank, so it's high risk, it's protected by rails, so it's low risk, things like that. Lane width, again, you should have that, but there are things you could do pretty easily. You can probably think of some way to do some kind of differential or qualitative or surrogate data. So as an example, what do you see here? Throw it in the Q&A and I'll look at the Q&A question while y'all are typing in. What do you see here? Ah, that's a good question. So you see some ditches on one side and the other side of the ditch was filled in. Okay. You see a lack of shoulders. So what you want to start doing is, as you're looking at your investigations, as your crashes, look at the risk factors that go in here. And those might be the ones you have to investigate for your entire community. And you might also be going, even after you implement something, did things get worse? Did they get better? Okay? So as an example, an alternative, what do you see here? There should be two or three things you see here, and then I'll answer Angela's question. You see a glove end on a rail system? Yeah, those boxing ends should never be allowed. Those are one of the most dangerous things. The rails aren't great, okay? There probably isn't enough deflection distance behind them to not hit those trees. There's no shoulders. There's an edge drop off. There's only a center line, not an edge line. Again, start looking at those issues to come up with your common risk factors. The question that was asked by Angelo, it had to deal with the fact that in their community, people are driving across from one side of the state to another, where the time you're allowed the bar to stay open changes. And so now you've got the problem of people at the middle of the night driving who might, let's just be honest, be really ready for the fourth quarter. Probably should be home, but they're not. So there you're probably going to have to develop plans to look at enforcement, lighting, maybe even doing some proactive approaches of education for getting people to get that designated driver, to call that cab. You can't just do one thing. Enforcement alone is not going to work. We're going to have to do a multifaceted approach. So again, think about your data and go back to those risk factors of speed, volume, lane width, shoulder width, clear zone and trees and how much distance you've got, curves and their associated radius, improper super elevation, and of course, as we've discussed, previous crashes. Probably should at least be looking at those, and you're going to need to use those to finalize your risk factors anyway. And again, these are the most common ones you see in almost all the reports. There may be others in your community, and you may want to include those as well. And that's where you have those stakeholders helping you get that good information. Now, I told you I'd tell you a little bit about CLEAR. CLEAR is the Crash Location and Engineering Analysis Repository. The acronym department really did a great job on this one, okay? So if you can't remember anything else, you can remember we need to be clear of accidents or clear of crashes, okay? What this is a repository of all the crashes that have been put in by the public safety officials, okay? So you can do an analysis pretty quick. So let's look at a couple of quick analyses and things you can do with these data. And I know there are limitations. All databases have limitations. But as a starting point, at least you know what you've got and you can learn what you don't have and what you have to go collect as you're developing your plan. And maybe your first cut, you just use clear, develop your plan, and then go, boy, I really wish we had X, Y, and Z. Okay, then start developing and getting X, Y, and Z. And we'll talk about a way to maybe even fund that in a little bit. Now, what we did is we actually took data for a 10-year period in Lewis County, okay? All crashes, all types, all roads, local, state, everything we could get. There are 8,928 crashes that occurred that are recorded in the county. Now, that doesn't include near misses. That's something we know is an issue, but these are the number that are included. Remember, last week we talked about the focus on fatalities and serious crashes, or KIA or KA crashes. If you just look at those, the whole county in that same 10-year period, there were only 214, partly because it's a rural area. So if you're in a rural area, you may have to expand and look at an entire county or a large, even a region, to get your data. And that's where MPOs and regional planning development boards, maybe even the Tug Hill Commission, come into play, and they all have access to CLEAR. If you work for the government, you can get access to CLEAR. And you could, for short-term activities, as part of a study, get access for a consulting firm, okay? What's cool about CLEAR is you can even focus in. And we did that. We just picked a couple of places. We focused in. We got the serious crashes. And we found two that were really right on top of each other on the same curve. And so we decided to look at them. And in both cases, somebody went off the road, coming around the corner, going in the same direction. Be careful about the direction of the arrows. The north is different in these two. Okay? They went around the corner, and we had essentially a head-on. Okay? Now, both these were just serious crashes. But serious crashes are still life-changing. So you can go down and look at that and go, okay, this is something we need to think about for a risk factor. Is it a radius problem? Is it a lane width problem? Is it a sight distance issue? Super elevation? And start looking at your crash risk factors. And you can all take these data and you can create what are called crash trees. Now, I just had a little fun with this one because it sort of looks like an arrow as we move forward. But imagine a crash tree. This is St. Lawrence County. We did one for St. Lawrence County, and we looked at the crashes that occurred over a 5-year period in rural roads just to get ourselves a subset. Okay? 85 crashes. You broke it down by traffic volume, AADT, average annual daily traffic. And as you can see, crashes were actually in the roads less than 2,000 were at a higher number than even roads with 5,000 vehicles per day. Probably due to the fact the higher volume roads tend to be built a little bit wider, a little bit straighter. But that's the whole point about doing crash data and risk analysis. You figure these things out, okay? Looked at the speed of the crashes. Was the speed limit, this is just speed limit in this case, was the speed limit less than 30? Or was it equal to or more than 35 miles an hour? Okay? And as you would expect, most of them were higher speed. Okay, you could have broken it down at 45 or 55. You could pick different levels for speed, and you're probably going to want to do that. And then was it on a curve or was it on a straight section of highway? And when you develop these crash trees, you can start looking for common crashes and then maybe even go back and see if they're overrepresented. So speed, as you'd expect, 95% of the serious and fatals, higher speed. Curves, 42%. Now, do you think 42% of the mileage in St. Lawrence County, which is a relatively flat county, at least in the northern half, are curves? Probably not. So that's probably overrepresented in a lot of ways. But you'd have to compare that to the number of segments, which is part of that development of the overall plan that you're going to have to look at. Now, as you do this work, you're going to need to break your system into segments. You could do it by block in an urban area. You could go from intersection to intersection in a rural area. You could even in an urban area separate out just the intersections alone. Good way to think about this is think about your asset management plan. And you all have an asset management plan, I hope? Yes? Good? Good. Use the same breakdown. Think about what would be a project that you would do. Look at project size and do your analysis on road segments. Now, you may be doing work on whole corridors. You may be doing a project that goes from point A to point B, but in terms of doing your analysis, you want to break it down to blocks where you can truly see differential between point A and point B, okay? Now, we could talk more about road segments. If we had a lot more time, we would definitely want to do that. We got an hour together, so we're actually going to have to go past proving solutions pretty quick here. We'll be talking about that next week. We're going to talk about not just the rural ones and the roadway departure ones, but we'll talk about some crosswalk improvements and some roundabouts and better signals as well. Because we know that really when you develop your local road safety plan, you're going to want to look at all the possible solutions and then take the ones that you're going to want to implement and figure out how to implement them in the best way. So let's just ask, of the ones I've listed, and I could have listed more, of the ones listed, which ones have you actually used? Okay? And I'll just go ahead and put the responses up. So let's see how many people have used different ones here. Okay? So almost everybody's used pavement markings. Yep. And again, if you can't access the poll, you can put it into the Q&A. A lot of you have done curve delineation, as I would expect. Safety edge. Okay. Rumble strips. Clear zone, crosswalks. A few have roundabouts. Oh, 10 of you actually. That's pretty good. Okay. And then better signals. Okay. There are proven countermeasures, and that's the key. You want to try to stay with the proven countermeasures, not only because somebody else has already done the work to check that they are effective, but they've learned the hard way when there are issues. I notice only 4 of you put down rumble strips. I think we need to look more at rumble strips, and we'll talk about them next week. But there are alternatives to the standard, and where you put them matters. And yes, some agencies, including New York State DOT, have put down rumble strips and learned some issues. Well, guess what? Take advantage of that. Learn from others. I got away with more than a few things growing up because I was the youngest of 3, and I watched what my older brothers did. Was I always? I'll just say that I learned from my brothers. I'll put it that way. I'll make myself look better. But the point is, learn from others. Use proven countermeasures, and we'll talk about a lot of these next week in our webinar. Okay. Now you're going to then implement solutions. Okay. Now you're going to have all this information. You're going to have everything. You're trying to figure out how to implement it. It's somewhat like playing a piece of music. You read through that piece of music and you figure out, okay, I'm going to play this here and I'm going to play that there. Oh, I'm going to have a hard time with this particular combination of notes. You need to work with the director and modify things so that it still sounds like music. And that's going to be true here too. You need to implement your plan, which means you got to have buy-in from the stakeholders who are paying the bills, helping get the grants, and from the public when you do put in a roundabout or rumble stripes and go, I hate roundabouts. Well, you got to get buy-in. That's part of the communication as the stakeholder part and education. You're going to have to find money. It might be local dollars. It might be a grant. I'll mention grants here right at the end. Okay? Your plan needs to include both capital work that you're going to make improvements that have more than a 10-year life, but you're also going to want to think about the maintenance of those activities. Okay? So behind me on my screen here, I've got some rail that's behind me. Can you maintain that rail? If you want to put up cable rail systems, do you go back and check to make sure the turnbuckles have got the wires at the right tension so that they do the job properly because they're supposed to all be even? So you have to think about the maintenance that you need to do and not let trees grow up behind the rail or a tree grow up on a bank that used to be clear and now has a dangerous fixed object in it. So include that in your plan. And then when do you update the plan? We're going to come back to that one in just a second. So think about how long is the plan valuable? And the best plans have some flexibility in them. In that, yes, we might have a priority to do this corridor or this site, but knowing that, oh, wait a second, they're doing some utility work, let's push it back for a year or 2. And then we'll get to that one as soon as we can. A good plan has some flexibility in it. Don't follow it just blindly. Think. So let me ask you this. How long in years, give me whole years, is a local road safety plan valid? How long do you think? Just off the top of your head, what would you think? 3 years, 10 years, 2 years, 5 years? Okay. Somebody put in the Q&A, three. I got a three. Here's the two questions that I would ask myself in terms of how often I need to look at that plan. One, how long did it take you to do it in the first place? Will not take as long the second time, but you may want to do some initial analysis. So that is the minimum cycle. If you wait 10 years and you've done work for 10 years, what's happening to the traffic? Is traffic changing? If it's not changing much, you might be able to get away with 10, but 10's probably pushing it. 5, yeah, I can say 5 is not too bad. Here's the point I want to take home. Think about your plan and when do you think you want to go back and fix it? And be looking early to do that, especially if you think you need to collect new data or you need to go beyond Clear or some other repository of information. So think about it. And remember, at the end of this, you're going to have an implementation plan that is a little different than the local road safety plan. Okay? And so you're going to have an implementation plan that's going to have a whole bunch of stuff in it. Now, you're probably all thinking the same thing right now. You're going, it's too small. Well, yeah, I know it's small. It's only a model. I just want you to think about it, and the details matter. Okay? So in the local road safety plan, you may have a list of priorities that you're going to work on. You may have a list of solutions and projects. Now, you may have some general cost in the local road safety plan, but when you get to the project level, you're going to have to do a lot more detailed cost. When you do that, do me a favor. Please be sure to include the benefits. I've seen a lot of these plans that I've read through, and I'm like, oh, here's how much it's going to cost to implement, but there's nothing in there that says, well, here's the expected number of lives saved according to the road factors clearinghouse or crash modification factors clearinghouse. So think about the benefits, and you need an estimate on the timing. Is this something we can implement now? Is it something we can implement in a few years? Is it going to be something we have to do over several years because of the utilities and the right of way? So think about the timing. And when you do all of this, you then can focus on how do we pay for it? Where's the funding coming from? Because got to have funding. Now, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are lots of existing plans. I know of four. Three of which I was able to find on the web from Chemung County, the St. Regis Mohawks, and the Seneca Nation. Wyoming County does have one, and if I ever find a link for it, I'll pop it up. I'll keep looking. Okay. I know in development, they're doing one here in Ithaca and Tompkins County. They're doing one in Albany area, Rochester. Okay. So there's lots of things out there as possibilities. Don't have to reinvent the wheel. But it would really be good if everybody had a local road safety plan that can be part of their overall management. Now, in terms of your focus, you could focus on risk factors alone. Just go for represented crashes and systemic safety and things like that. You could focus on locations. Some people like to look at intersections and corridors. I read one out of Washington State where the particular county, because every county did one, they focused on specific corridors. Their arterial roads, their collector roads, and then their local roads. So they did that prioritization. They used a data-driven approach. So the obvious traffic was one of the biggest issues. But then the individual crashes to work on, they had to go back to the risk factors. Okay? And then you could say, we're going to take a particular countermeasure and we're going to choose the proven countermeasure. In this case, we're going to apply it systematically. That's different than systemic. Systemic is a risk-based approach where you focused on where the crashes might occur due to risk. A systematic approach is we're going to now use this particular countermeasure on everything, every single time. So we're always going to put up curve delineation. We're always going to use safety edge when we're paving. We're going to have a consistent policy for clear zones on all types of roadways. And that's a systematic approach. And yes, that can be a little bit confusing to some people. So let's do one more example in our hour together. Again, we had more time, we could even get more detail. We've identified our stakeholders, hopefully, and we're going to use safety data now and come up with our risk factors and choose some solutions. Okay? So let's just say as an example, as part of the project that's being done here in Ithaca, Tompkins County and Ithaca City itself, they're going to map all the crashes in the area. I know they're doing that now. I've talked with them a little bit about it. They're going to make a list of common risk factors. They're using CLEAR plus some additional analysis to plot everything and look at the risk factors. And they're going to look for the common and overrepresented crashes. Okay? And again, you could use weighting factors or not. That's up to you. Okay? But you might come up with a list of crash factors for, say, urban areas. Okay? So maybe volumes over 2,000 vehicles per day, curve radius less than 150 feet, number of lanes greater than two. By the way, those three came from the New York State Department of Transportation's Roadway Departure Safety Action Plan. So those are already available. You could even use those for your urban collectors and arterials. Um, but maybe they find speed as an issue, higher speed, because there are some higher speed segments in the Tompkins County, area, that even in the urban parts. And maybe the signalized intersections are a problem for a variety of reasons, that there are more common crashes at the signalized intersections, or it might turn out the unsignalized intersections that are the problem, or four-way stops. That's the whole point of doing these analyses. But let's just take these five as an example. And now we've got this overall local road safety plan for the entire community. But let's say a subset of the community wants to implement now and put together an implementation plan, a more detailed plan, because the local road safety plan is a broad thing. So let's say just Cornell wants to do it, and let's say they only want to do it on central campus, okay? So they go through and they look at those risk factors. Now, in this particular case, going back, they don't have any roads that are above 2 lanes, so we're going to ignore that one for now. So we start looking at this, okay? And we'll come in here, we'll look at our risk factors, and we'll make a list of all the roads on central campus, and I actually ran out of room to do every road that would fit. So roads that have a signal, segments that have a signal on them, a traffic signal, high speed. Oh, none of the roads are over 30 miles an hour, so that risk factor we wouldn't use anyway. And this may happen. You may find risk factors you don't use. Maybe you replace it with something else. Have you had a crash? Usually the severe and fatals. Is there a curve? And then what's the traffic volume? Okay. Now, a question that's in the Q&A, it's an important one. What's an overrepresented crash? These are crashes that occur at a higher frequency than you would expect just based on the number of segments or the number of intersections as an example. So let's say that you looked at sharp curves, which is what the DOT did. 10% of your curves are less than 300-foot radius. You would, if nothing was overrepresented, we'd expect 10% of your crashes. But if instead you measure 20% of your crashes are occurring on those sharp curves, that's an overrepresented crash location, and it's due to curves. Okay? So what we would do then is we'd add up all the factors. Okay? So if we add up all the factors, that's the kind of thing that we can take advantage of. So in the Q&A, real quickly, tell me, what's our highest priority road? What's our highest priority road? In the Q&A, what's the highest priority? It'd be Feeney Way 2, also known as East Avenue 2, but they changed the name. Yeah, very good. So that would be your highest priority. And then when you develop your implementation plan, you then want to focus back on the common factors. So you want to match your solutions to the risk factors. In this case, you might want to look at your pavement markings because there's a curve. You also might want to look at delineation. Even in an urban area, delineation can help, which could include the pavement markings, by the way, as we'll talk about 2 weeks when we talk about curves. Crosswalk improvements might help. Better signals might help. But you need to go in and you need to look things over, okay? Let's see here. It says Hoy's, you're right. Hoy should have been 3. I was changing things this morning to make sure we had 1 and I missed it. Hoy has 3. Okay, so that would also be a high priority 1 as well, okay? Note, by the way, that Feeney Way didn't have a crash and Hoy did, even though they're equal. But the reality is, again, that's a factor. We would then prioritize based upon that, okay? Now, in terms of money, well, If you don't have a local road safety plan and you want to go get federal dollars, they're going to go, well, you could get some money to help pay for developing a plan, and there is money for that, but you're not going to be able to get an implementation grant. Pretty clear that you need to have a local road safety plan before you try to get implementation grant money. And if you've got a local road safety plan, but you really haven't got to the level of implementation of projects, you could do a demonstration grant to try something out. And there are monies there to try out Safety Edge, to try out some small project that you have not quite sure about. You know, put rumble strips in a spot area to see how they work before you implement them systemically or systematically. Okay? So again, the plan is to identify the stakeholders, use safety data, choose proven solutions, and make sure you implement them. So my last couple of slides here, so we can get out of here on time, is our lovely PDH questions to finish everything up, though we're pretty good there. What's the difference between systemic and systematic? What's the difference between systemic and systematic? See if I can get one or two people to pop an answer in there for me. Site-specific issues, risk factors versus system-wide. Yep, that's one way to think about it. Systemic, we look at the risk factors related to the issues. Whole system versus process. Okay, risk-based. Yeah. If you think about it, the systemic is risk-based. We're looking for overrepresented, there's more crashes than we would expect, or the really common crash types that are occurring. And we apply things just in those places or for those types of crashes, versus systematic, which is the entire network with a focus area, maybe on, as I say, safety edge or curve delineation or stripes. And we apply them system-wide. So just keep that in mind. I actually like the term risk-based versus whole network sometimes, just to think about that. Now, in terms of developing a local road safety plan, one of these is not required. Do you need analysis of existing conditions? Do you need well thought out prioritization of work? Public involvement? Only include your collectors and arterials, commitment by the elected board, or updated recently. And again, we talked about whether that's 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, or even 10 years. Which one of these is not required? In fact, has led to some issues. Yeah, you're getting there. Yeah. You want to include the collectors, arterials, and local roads. Federal dollars are available for all roads. There is no differentiation. And a good local road safety plan should look at all roads because the users, they just want to drive the road. So you got to include everything. Don't stop at just your collectors and arterials. They may be a higher priority because of risk factors and traffic volumes and speeds, but local roads need to be part of the plan as well. We're going to be doing 2 more of these webinars in this particular series. Next week, we start our foundational series on Tuesdays, but this series continues for the next couple of weeks. Next week is proven countermeasures, and then we're going to focus specifically on curve issues, not only the proven countermeasures, but other things we should be thinking about at our curves, since we know they're really responsible. They're where a lot of our crashes occur. With that, I stole 35 seconds from you, but thank you for sticking with us for an extra 35 seconds. Any questions in the Q&A? Last chance for questions. No questions in the Q&A. So with that, I'm going to say thanks for joining us. Hope to see you next week, and let's stay safe out there. Bye-bye.